The galaxy had a list. It was not a short list. It was not a simple list. It had been built over 6,000 years by the greatest scientific minds of 47 different species, and it was, by every measure that mattered, the most important document ever produced by any civilization in known space. The Galactic Conclave called it the Threat Index. Every dangerous thing in the universe, every predator, every plague, every volatile system, every species that had ever looked at another species and thought about eating it, was on the list. They were ranked, 1 through 10. 1 meant mostly harmless. 10 meant extinction level. A 10 had never been recorded. The closest anyone had ever come was the void beasts of Sector 9. They sat at 9.0. Entire fleets had turned and run from them without firing a single shot. The psychic frequency the beasts emitted hit the brainstem of every known species, like a hammer hitting a bell, and the only thought that came out the other side was one word: run. It was not a choice. It was not cowardice. It was biology. It was 6,000 years of galactic history saying, very clearly, that some things were simply not worth approaching. The Conclave had looked at the void beasts, written down 9.0, and moved on. Below them, at 8.5, sat the Kreth. The Kreth were large. The Kreth were armored. The Kreth had fought wars across 11 star systems over 4 centuries, and their military doctrine was simple: hit first, hit hard, do not stop hitting until there was nothing left to hit. They had absorbed 9 civilizations into their empire. Not conquered, absorbed. There was a difference. Conquered things still had names. Absorbed things just became Kreth. The Conclave had looked at the Kreth, written down 8.5, and kept a very respectful distance. The list went on: plague species, hive minds, the crystalline intelligence of the Dravith cluster, which communicated exclusively through gravitational distortion and had once accidentally collapsed a small moon while trying to say hello. Everything had a number. Everything had a place. The universe was vast and strange and full of things that could kill you, but the Conclave had mapped all of it, filed all of it, and built a civilization on the understanding that knowledge was the best armor. So when Scout Vessel 7 of the Outer Reach Survey Division dropped back into communication range with a full report on a previously uncatalogued system, 1 star, 8 planets, 3rd planet from the Sun showing signs of advanced civilization, the process was routine. Pull the data, assess the species, assign the number, file the report, schedule a first contact mission. The data came in. Senior Analyst Vereth of the Conclave's Xenobiology Division read it at his desk, which was a low, curved surface that fit the shape of his 4 lower limbs. In an office that smelled faintly of the mineral compound his species found calming. He had done this 800 times. He would do it 800 more before he retired. He read the atmospheric composition first: nitrogen, oxygen, traces of argon. Unremarkable. He checked the star. A yellow dwarf, middle-aged, stable. Unremarkable. He pulled up the biological survey of the dominant species. He read it once. He went back to the beginning and read it again. Then he sent a message to his supervisor that said simply, "You need to see this." The dominant species of the 3rd planet called themselves humans. They were bipedal. That was not unusual. 3 other species in the Conclave were bipedal. What was unusual was everything else. They had no natural armor. Their skin was soft enough to be broken by a moderately sharp piece of their own plant life. They had no venom. Their claws, which they called fingernails, were so flat and blunt that they could not puncture even the membrane of a standard-issue data tablet. Their eyes could not see in darkness. Their hearing range was narrow by any galactic standard. Their sense of smell was so poor that a Kreth hatchling, barely old enough to walk, could track prey more efficiently. They could not survive in space without elaborate mechanical assistance. They could not survive underwater. They could not survive in temperatures more than 40 degrees above or below what their narrow biological range required. On paper, they were prey. The initial threat assessment ran through the standard algorithm: physical capability, natural defenses, observed aggressive behavior, technological development, social complexity, and came back with a number: 2.1. Vereth looked at 2.1 and felt, for the first time in a long career, a flicker of something he could not immediately name. It was not concern. It was not interest. It was something smaller, a minor itch at the back of a thought. He filed the number. He scheduled the first contact mission. He went home and did not think about it. But the itch stayed. The first contact vessel was the Serenthi, a mid-class diplomatic ship with a crew of 60 and a contact team of 12. Its captain was a Velhari named Surath, who had led 14 successful first contact missions and had the calm, steady demeanor of someone who had seen enough of the universe to stop being surprised by it. She read the survey report on the journey to the human star system. She read it 3 times. She called her contact team together and read it to them out loud. The first thing they noticed was the wars. Not the occasional wars, not the historical wars that most species eventually grew past. The humans had been at war with themselves, not with outside threats, with themselves, one group of their own species against another, for the entirety of their recorded history. 5,000 years of written records. There was not a single century in those records without a large-scale organized conflict between human factions. They had fought over land, they had fought over belief systems, they had fought over lines drawn on maps that didn't correspond to any geographic feature. They had fought over resources. They had fought over the memory of old fights. And somehow, they had not wiped themselves out. They had come close, multiple times. They had built weapons capable of ending all life on their planet, and had pointed those weapons at each other for decades, while both sides agreed, in tense and fragile negotiations, not to use them. And they had held to that. Mostly. The planet was still there. The species was still there. "That's not normal," said the junior contact officer, Prith, who was young enough that things still surprised him. "No," said Surath, "it is not." She kept reading. The second thing they noticed was the animals. The humans shared their planet with thousands of other species. The survey team had catalogued several apex predators, creatures that, in any sane ecological system, would be the top of the food chain. Large, fast, with natural weapons that made the humans' soft hands look laughable. The humans had domesticated them. Not all of them, but enough. They had taken the large four-limbed predators that their own early ancestors had once feared, that still had the full biological toolkit of a killing machine, and they had bred them over generations into companions. They kept them in their homes, the animals slept on their furniture, the humans fed them from their own food supplies. They attached deep emotional significance to these animals. When the animals died, the humans grieved. Surath stopped on that page for a long moment. She had a biological understanding of domestication. Every species that had reached an agricultural stage had domesticated some animals. But those were prey animals. Docile things made more docile. What the humans had done was different. They had looked at predators and thought, "We should make friends with that." And they had. She kept reading. The third thing, the thing that made the contact team go quiet for the rest of the briefing, was the medicine. Every species that achieved advanced civilization eventually developed medicine. The treatment of illness and injury was a logical development. What was not logical, what was, by any reasonable biological analysis, deeply strange, was what the humans did when they encountered a new disease. They ran toward it. Not all of them, but a specific subset. Scientists, researchers, volunteers, would deliberately travel to places where a lethal pathogen was active. They would collect samples. They would study the thing that was killing their own people. They would work in close proximity to it, wearing their thin mechanical protection, knowing that the protection was not perfect, knowing that some of them would get sick and some of them would die. They called these people heroes. They built monuments to the ones who died doing it. And then more of them volunteered to do it again. Prith was the one who said it, quietly, to no one in particular. They run toward things that kill them. Apparently, said Surath. On purpose. Yes. Why? Surath did not have an answer. She kept reading, because she had a feeling the answer was somewhere in the data, buried under 5,000 years of these strange, soft, impossibly durable creatures and their incomprehensible decisions. She found the horror stories. Not histories, stories. The humans had a category of creative fiction specifically designed to frighten the audience. They would sit, alone, in dark rooms, or together in groups, and consume stories whose entire purpose was to make them feel fear, not as a warning, not as a training exercise, for pleasure. They called it entertainment. They did it at night, before sleeping. They called it relaxing. Surath put the report down. She sat in the quiet of her office on the Serenthi for 4 minutes, which was longer than she had ever sat doing nothing in her professional life. Then she picked the report back up and kept reading. Because this was her job and she was good at her job, but some distant and previously dormant part of her brain was sending up a signal she hadn't felt in decades. It was something like unease. The Serenthi arrived at the edge of the human star system on a Tuesday, which was not a measurement of time the crew used or recognized. but was what the humans called it on the inhabited third planet, where they had divided their rotation cycle into 7 segments and given each one a name, which was exactly the sort of thing a species with too much organizational energy and not enough outlets for it would do. The first contact protocol was standard, broadcast across all detectable communication frequencies. Translation algorithms built from the survey team's analysis of human signal transmissions. The humans had been broadcasting radio and television signals into space for over a century, completely unaware that anyone was listening, which gave the conclave's linguists an enormous and frankly bewildering archive to work with. The opening broadcast was simple, friendly. "We come in peace. We know you are there. We would like to talk." Then they waited. The human response came in 11 minutes. It was, after translation, a single question. "Are you the ones who've been picking up our old TV shows? Because we're really sorry about some of those." Surath read the translation twice. She asked her linguist if the translation was correct. The linguist confirmed that it was. She sat with that for a moment. Then she wrote her preliminary assessment for the conclave. It was 3 pages long. The conclusion took up the last paragraph. She wrote it carefully, choosing each word with the attention she gave to things that mattered. "The human species does not fit cleanly into any existing category of our threat index. Their physical capabilities are genuinely limited. Their technology is impressive, but not beyond what we would expect from a civilization at their stage of development. Their social structure is complex and frequently self-destructive. On every standard metric, they rank low. But the standard metrics were built on the assumption that a species' behavior correlates to its biological toolkit. The humans appear to operate on a different principle entirely. Their behavior consistently exceeds what their biology should allow. They feel fear. All biological evidence confirms this, and they proceed anyway. I do not yet have a framework for what that means in practical terms. I recommend we approach with caution and continue observation. I am raising the preliminary threat assessment from 2.1 to 4.0, pending further data." She submitted the report. She went back to the bridge and looked at the pale blue planet on the view screen. One moon, white and pockmarked. Oceans covering most of the surface. Thin atmosphere, fragile by any standard. The beings on that surface had built all of this from nothing, with their flat fingernails and their poor night vision and their strange soft skin. And they had been killing each other and curing each other and frightening each other for fun the entire time. 4.0 felt wrong. She didn't know what the right number was. She wasn't sure the right number existed yet. She told the communications officer to send the formal first contact confirmation and schedule a diplomatic meeting. Then she went to her quarters and did something she had not done since her first deep space assignment, 20 years ago, when she was young enough that the size of the universe still got to her. She sat on the edge of her bunk, in the dark, and she thought about what was on that planet, and she felt, very quietly and very privately, a specific thing she did not have a professional reason to feel and could not entirely explain. She felt like she was the one being watched. Back at the conclave, the report hit Senior Analyst Verath's desk on a morning when he had a full schedule and no patience for complications. He read the preliminary assessment. He read the threat index update. He sat back in his chair, which fit the shape of his 4 lower limbs perfectly, in the office that smelled of mineral compound, and he stared at the ceiling. 4.0. For a species that couldn't see in the dark. He pulled up the addendum, the cultural notes Surath had attached, the catalog of behaviors that didn't fit the model, the wars, the predator companions, the researchers running at plagues, the horror stories consumed for pleasure in the dark. His subordinate, a young analyst named Feth, who was new enough to still ask questions out loud, leaned around the partition. "What are they?" Verath thought about it. "I don't know," he said. Feth waited, because Verath never just said "I don't know" without saying something after it. "That's the problem," Verath said. "I don't know, and that's the problem." He approved the 4.0 rating and forwarded the report to the Conclave's Standing Committee on Newly Contacted Species. He flagged it as low priority, because 4.0 was low priority, because nothing with a 4.0 had ever been anything other than a minor note in galactic history. He almost believed that. Almost. He went home that evening and, for the first time in 11 years, checked that the locks on his residential unit were properly sealed. He couldn't have said why. The Kreth did not ask permission. That was not how they operated. That had never been how they operated. In 400 years of expansion across 11 star systems, the Kreth had developed a military doctrine so simple it fit on a single line of text, and that line was, Find them, show them what you have, wait for them to understand, collect the colony. It had worked 9 times. It had worked against species with faster ships and heavier weapons, and more soldiers than the Kreth had fielded. It worked because the doctrine was not really about the ships or the weapons. It was about the waiting. You showed up with enough force that any rational species would do the math. You gave them time to do the math. And every rational species eventually did the math and reached the same answer. Because every rational species in the galaxy had one thing in common. They wanted to survive. Survival meant you didn't throw yourself against something bigger than you. Survival meant you weighed the cost and chose differently. The Kreth had never met a species that couldn't do that math. Fleet Commander Dreth had led 6 subjugation missions. He was not a cruel being by his species' standards. He did not enjoy the destruction. He simply understood that destruction was occasionally necessary, the way removing a broken component was necessary, not with malice, just with the clear understanding that the machine worked better after. He had given the surrender broadcast on 6 planets and received compliance on 6 planets. He expected to give it a 7th time. He selected 12 ships. 12 was generous for a 4.0. You needed 3 ships for a 4.0. He brought 12 because the Conclave's preliminary report had a note at the bottom. Approach with caution, continue observation, and Dreth was professional enough to take a note like that seriously, even when the number next to the species said they were barely worth classifying. The 12 ships crossed into the human star system on what the humans called a Thursday. Dreth noted the star. Yellow, stable, unremarkable. He noted the planets. 8, standard distribution. The inhabited third one sitting in the middle of the system like something that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. He noted the single moon. He noted the communication signals the humans were broadcasting, the constant low-level noise of a civilization talking to itself, radio and light and data streaming in every direction the way a species did when it hadn't yet learned that the universe was listening. He broadcast the surrender demand on every detectable frequency. Standard text, standard translation. The Conclave's linguists had provided the human language files. The message was simple. You are now a territory of the Kreth Empire. Stand down all military vessels and orbital installations. Representatives will arrive in 48 hours. Resistance is not recommended. Then he waited. The 48 hours passed. No response. Dreth checked the communications equipment. It was functioning. He checked that the message had transmitted on the correct frequencies. It had. He sent the message again, with a slightly shorter deadline, 24 hours, and the addition of a visual component, because sometimes species needed to see the ships to understand what the message meant. The 24 hours passed. Still no response. The Dreth was not by nature an impatient being, but he had a schedule. He had 6 other systems on the expansion list. He ordered the fleet to move in toward the 3rd planet, slow and visible, the way you moved when you wanted to be seen. This was the final stage of the doctrine. This was where the species looked out their windows, or their view screens, or whatever they used to look at the sky, and they saw 12 warships moving toward them, and they understood in a way that text transmissions sometimes couldn't convey, and they responded. Every species responded at this stage. He moved the fleet in to the edge of what the humans called the asteroid belt, a wide band of rock and debris between their 4th and 5th planets, and held position, visible, waiting. Then his sensor officer said, "Commander, I'm reading 7 vessels. Human configuration, moving out from the 3rd planet." Dreth looked at the sensor display. 7 ships, small, asymmetrical, which was the first thing he noticed, because every spacefaring species eventually converged on efficient hull shapes, smooth, aerodynamic, built for minimum resistance. These were not that. These looked like they had been built in pieces by different groups who hadn't talked to each other, then bolted together and told to function. One ship had a wider forward section than its engines should have been able to propel. One had what appeared to be external modifications added after original construction, running along the hull like scar tissue. They were not uniform. They were not elegant. They were moving toward his fleet. 7 vessels, Dreth said. "Yes, Commander." Against 12. "Yes, Commander." He waited for the human ships to stop, to hold position at a distance, to broadcast something, a response. A negotiation request, a delay tactic. That was what species did when they came out to meet you. They came out to talk, they kept distance, they stalled. The human ships did not stop. They kept coming. "Broadcast the surrender demand again," Dreth said. "Direct transmission to the incoming vessels." The communications officer broadcast it. They waited. The human ships kept coming. "Are they receiving?" Dreth asked. "Yes, Commander. They're receiving. I'm also reading communication signals between their vessels. They're talking to each other." "About what?" A pause. The translation algorithm worked in real time, imperfectly, filling in gaps with the best available options. It's fragmented. One of them appears to be commenting on the temperature of a beverage. Dreth turned slowly from the view screen to look at his communications officer. His communications officer looked back at him with the particular expression of a being who has just said something they wish they hadn't. "The temperature," Dreth said, "of a beverage. That is the best translation available, Commander." The human ships entered weapons range. They fired first. What happened in the next 19 minutes was recorded by every sensor on every Kreth vessel. The recordings were later recovered, analyzed, replayed, and argued over in conclave military briefings for years. No single explanation satisfied everyone. The most detailed analysis came from a Velhari strategic analyst named Orvith, who spent 4 months reviewing the data and produced a report that was 60 pages long and could be summarized in 2 sentences. The humans fought as though losing was not a variable they had included in their calculations. This was not bravado. It appeared to be a genuine cognitive orientation. The first 3 Kreth ships were disabled in the opening exchange. Not destroyed, disabled. The humans had targeted propulsion and weapons systems with a precision that suggested they had studied Kreth warship schematics, which they could not have had, which meant they had worked it out from the sensor data available during the approach, which meant that in the time between detecting the Kreth fleet and engaging it, some human on one of those mismatched ships had looked at 12 warships they had never seen before and figured out where to hit them. Dreth pulled his formation back. Standard response to unexpected resistance. Create distance. Reassess. Bring firepower to bear from range. The human ships followed. They should not have followed. You didn't follow a larger fleet into a ranged engagement when you had smaller ships and fewer weapons. You held position, used your mobility advantage, forced the larger fleet to come to you. That was basic tactical logic. Every species that had ever built a warship had worked that out inside the first generation of space combat. The human ships followed anyway, closing distance, negating the range advantage completely, turning what should have been a clean standoff into something messy and close and ferocious. 2 of the mismatched ships took severe damage in the process. One of them, the one with the external hull modifications, the scar tissue running along its sides, took a hit that blew out its forward section and kept coming, rotating to bring a secondary weapons mount to bear, and Dreth watched it on the view screen and felt something he had not felt in a subjugation mission since his first one, when he was young and had not yet learned that doctrine was reliable. He felt uncertain. He lost 4 more ships in the next 8 minutes. Not disabled this time, destroyed. The humans had changed tactics mid-engagement, not in response to orders, because the communication analysis showed the human ships were still talking to each other in fragments, short bursts, not the coordinated command structure a fleet action should have required. They were adapting in real time, each ship making its own decisions, and somehow those decisions were combining into a coherent pressure that was pushing the Kreth formation apart. Dreth ordered a regrouping maneuver. The fleet moved to execute. One of the damaged human ships, the one that had lost its forward section, rammed one of his vessels. Not as a suicide run, as a deliberate tactical obstacle. It put itself in the path of Dreth's regrouping maneuver and refused to move, and took the collision, and the impact disrupted the formation timing long enough for the other human ships to press the advantage. The crew of the damaged human ship survived. They had moved to the reinforced sections before impact. They had planned it. They had planned to ram a Kreth warship with their broken ship and survive it, and they had done it, and it had worked. Dreth ordered a full retreat. He had 5 ships left. He pulled them back fast, past the asteroid belt, past the outer planets, to the edge of the system, and he broadcast the emergency recall on the fleet frequency, and he sat in his command chair and looked at the view screen and breathed. The human ships did not follow them to the system edge. They stopped, held position, didn't pursue. The communications officer said, quietly, that the human ships were transmitting something on an open frequency. The translation came through in fragments. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was, as far as the algorithm could determine, an invitation. The human ships were broadcasting coordinates and what appeared to be a meeting request. They wanted to talk. After all of that, they wanted to talk. Dreth looked at his 5 remaining ships and his sensors showing 1 destroyed human vessel and 6 still functional ones, and he made a decision that went against every instinct his military career had built in him. He did not respond to the meeting request. He took his 5 ships, and he left the system, and he went straight back to the nearest Kreth command station, and he filed his report in person, because some reports you didn't trust to transmission delay. The report was long. The summary was short. Do not go back. Not yet. Not without more information. The report reached the conclave 3 days later. It arrived at the same time as the recovered communication logs from the destroyed human vessel, the 1 ship they had lost. The conclave's intelligence division spent a week going through those logs, translating everything they could, building a picture of what the humans had been saying to each other during the engagement. What they found did not make things clearer. The human crew had been, by every measure, aware of how badly outmatched they were. Their internal communications showed they knew the numbers. They knew the size differential. They knew what 12 Kreth warships had done to previous civilizations. There was nothing in the logs that suggested they didn't understand the stakes, and they had gone anyway, because the colony ships behind them, the ones evacuating the civilian population from the nearest orbital station, needed 17 more minutes to complete their runs, and someone had done that math and decided that 7 human ships buying 17 minutes against 12 Kreth warships was a reasonable trade. The conclave analyst who wrote the briefing report on this finding paused at that section for a long time before continuing. She wrote, "The humans did not go out to fight because they believed they could win. The data strongly suggests they went out to fight because they believed the cost was worth it. This distinction is not a small one. It is, I would argue, the most significant finding in this entire incident." The threat index was convened in emergency session. The committee looked at the data. They looked at the battle recordings. They looked at the communication logs. They looked at the ram maneuver and the mid-battle tactical adaptation and the 7 ships that had followed a fleet of 12 into close engagement without slowing down. They raised the threat index. 7.3. Someone on the committee said the number out loud and then said, immediately after, "That can't be right." And someone else said, "I know." And the first someone said, "They scored 2.1 2 months ago." And the second someone said, "I know." They filed the 7.3 anyway because the data supported it, and the conclave was built on data. But there was a note added at the bottom of the filing. It was short. It had not been formally approved by the committee. The analyst who wrote it added it anyway, at the end of a long day, before she sent the report. It said, "The threat index measures what a species can do. I am not sure it measures what a species will do. I am not sure those are the same thing." Fleet Commander Dreth sat in his quarters at the Kreth command station for 2 hours after filing his report. He was not a being given to sitting still. He was not a being given to thinking about things he couldn't act on. His career had been built on action. Clean, direct, decisive. You assessed the situation. You applied the doctrine. You moved on. He sat still for 2 hours. He thought about the ship that had rammed his vessel, the crew that had planned to be inside a ship that was going to hit a Kreth warship at speed, and had moved to the reinforced sections, and had survived, and had done it on purpose. He thought about the communications log his signals officer had flagged, the one from inside the damaged ship, between the impact and the retreat. The crew talking to each other, short transmissions, checking on each other. Someone had made a joke. He didn't know what the joke was. The translation was incomplete, but the laugh track was clear in the audio. Humans, inside a ship that had just rammed a Kreth warship, laughing. He thought about that for a long time. Then he got up and went back to his work, because he was Kreth and that was what you did. But he told his adjutant, quietly, before the day was done, to remove the human star system from the expansion list, indefinitely. His adjutant asked why. Dreth thought about the laugh in the audio log, about the beverage temperature comment before the engagement, about 7 ships following 12 into close range. "Because," he said, "I don't understand them yet. And I don't go somewhere I don't understand." He didn't say the other thing, the thing underneath, the thing that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the view screen, since the ram, since the laugh in the damaged ship. He didn't say, "I think they knew exactly what they were doing," every second of it, and it didn't slow them down even slightly. He kept that one to himself. Some things you didn't put in reports. The Velhari did not have a word for lying. This was not because they were naive. It was because they had never needed one. In 60,000 years of Velhari civilization, the concept of deliberate deception had remained largely theoretical, a thing that existed in the abstract, in philosophical debate, in the study of other species, because no Velhari had ever successfully lied to another Velhari and not been immediately detected. Their biology made it impossible. Every Velhari read the biological signals of every other Velhari in the room at all times, passively, the way other species processed background sound, heart rate, skin conductivity, the microscopic shifts in muscle tension beneath the face, pheromone releases keyed to specific emotional states. It was not a skill, it was not training. It was just what their nervous system did, the same way breathing was just what their lungs did. They had, over 60,000 years, become the galaxy's most trusted diplomats for exactly this reason. You could not deceive a Velhari. You could not perform calm when you were panicking. You could not perform calm when you were afraid. The truth of what you were feeling was always visible to them, whether you wanted it to be or not. Ambassador Lyrian had been doing this for 31 years. She had sat across from Kreth generals who were pretending to negotiate while planning offensives. She had sat across from Dravith intelligence clusters who communicated in 17 simultaneous emotional frequencies that would have overwhelmed any other species. She had mediated between species that actively wanted each other destroyed and found the thread of mutual interest that ran under the hatred because it was always there, and she could always find it. She had, in 31 years, never encountered a species she could not read. The Conclave sent her to Earth because the situation required the best, and she was the best, and also because the situation had become strange enough that no one else wanted the assignment, which was a thing no one said out loud but which Lyrian read clearly in every briefing room she entered in the weeks before departure. She read the full report on the flight over, the Kreth incident, the battle recordings. The threat index jumped from 2.1 to 7.3. The analyst's note at the bottom about the difference between what a species can do and what a species will do. She read the cultural survey, the wars, the predator companions sleeping on the furniture, the plague researchers, the horror stories consumed for relaxation. She read Surath's preliminary assessment from the first contact mission, the note about feeling watched, the careful, professional language that did not quite conceal the thing underneath it, which Lyrian, even reading a text document, could feel clearly. Surath had been unsettled and had not entirely recovered from it. Lyrian put the report down when she finished and sat for a while with her hands folded and her eyes on the viewport and the stars moving past. She was not unsettled. She was, if she was honest, curious. After 31 years, the universe rarely gave her something genuinely new. She was going to meet a species no one understood. She was going to sit across from them and read what they actually were, underneath the behavior that had everyone else confused, and she was going to find the thread of mutual interest that was always there, and she was going to build something with it. She was quite looking forward to it. She arrived on Earth on a Wednesday. The human ambassador's name was Elena Reyes. She was, by human standards, middle-aged. Lyrian had studied the species enough to calibrate the visual cues. Dark hair with threads of gray in it, lines at the corners of her eyes that deepened when she smiled, which she did immediately upon entering the conference room, while also being 12 minutes late, while also carrying a container of hot liquid that Lyrian's briefing notes identified as coffee, which was a caffeinated beverage that humans consumed in quantities that would, in most other species, indicate a dependency disorder. "Sorry I'm late," Reyes said, in her own language, which the translation units handled smoothly. "The traffic between the landing site and here is absolutely unhinged. Somebody needs to have a serious conversation with your shuttle pilots about merge lanes." She sat down, put the coffee on the table, looked at Lyrian, and smiled again. Lyrian, in the same moment, was doing what she always did, reading. Heart rate, elevated, significantly elevated, running at what her biological reference files indicated was approximately 40% above the human resting average. Skin, the faint surface-level response her secondary sensory organs picked up, indicated increased cortisol production. The micro-expressions moving across Reyes's face in the quarter seconds between one expression and the next, the ones no camera would catch, the ones that lived and died in the space between a thought and its performance, showed something that Lyrian's 31 years of practice identified without hesitation. Fear. Elena Reyes was afraid, genuinely, biologically, measurably afraid. Every signal her body was producing said so clearly. She was also leaning back in her chair with the posture of someone who had just sat down in a comfortable place they visited often. She was also making eye contact without the avoidance patterns that fear produced in every other species Lyrian had worked with. She was also still smiling, and the smile was not the performed smile of suppressed panic. Lyrian knew what that looked like, had seen it hundreds of times. It was something else. Warm, present, real. Lyrian went still in a way that she hoped did not show, because she was a professional, and professionals did not show confusion on their face during a first meeting. She responded to the comment about the shuttle pilots with something diplomatic, and the session began, and she spent the first 40 minutes doing what she always did, listening, observing, building her understanding of who she was actually sitting across from. And by the end of those 40 minutes, she had to acknowledge, privately, and with great discomfort, that she was not getting there. The signals were not adding up. Every biological marker said Reyes was afraid, and Reyes was, simultaneously, in the same body, in the same moment, performing none of the behaviors that fear produced. No hesitation, no deference, no avoidance. She negotiated hard on the first 3 agenda items, pushed back clearly on 2 of Lyrian's proposals, and at one point made a joke about galactic politics that was either very confident or very reckless, and Lyrian could not determine which. She could not determine which. After 31 years, she went back to her quarters that evening and sat with her notes and her biological readings, and she turned the data over and looked at it from every angle she knew, and she kept arriving at the same impossible conclusion. Elena Reyes was afraid, and it wasn't affecting her behavior, not in the way it should, not in the way fear affected every other species she had ever met. Fear, in every known species, was a signal and a brake. It said, stop, slow down, recalculate. It produced hesitation. It produced deference. It moved beings away from the source of the fear. That was what fear was for. That was the entire biological function of the thing. In Reyes, it appeared to be producing nothing except slightly elevated coffee consumption. Lyrian wrote her first night's notes and flagged 3 items as requiring further observation and went to sleep. And in the morning she went back to the conference room and sat across from Elena Reyes again. And over the next 2 weeks, she watched and read and measured and came no closer to a framework that explained what she was seeing. It was in the 3rd week that Lyrian started talking to the other humans, not formally. The conference schedule had gaps, meals, informal time, the social rituals that all diplomatic processes included. Lyrian used them. She talked to the aide who brought Reyes's coffee. She talked to the security personnel who stood outside the conference room. She talked to the technical staff who managed the translation systems. She talked to a groundskeeper she passed in the corridor who was apparently there to water a plant, which was doing fine, and who talked to her anyway for 10 minutes about the plant, and about the weather, and about a game involving a round object that his son was playing that weekend. She read all of them. They were all the same. Every one of them was carrying some level of biological stress. The aide was running on too little sleep. The security personnel were keyed to a low-level alertness that their bodies sustained through a shift. The groundskeeper had something. A chronic low-level worry, the particular signature of a concern that didn't go away, which Lyrian had learned to recognize across species as the signal of long-term financial or health anxiety. None of it was controlling them. They were all, every single one of them, doing their jobs, or having their conversations, or talking about their children's games, while underneath all of it, their bodies were running signals that in any other species would be producing different behavior, more caution, more hesitation, more stillness. The humans just kept moving. She requested a second meeting with Reyes outside the formal schedule, an informal one. She said she wanted to understand human culture better. Reyes said yes immediately, and showed up on time to this one, and brought 2 coffees, and put one in front of Lyrian, who did not drink coffee but who accepted it anyway because the gesture was clearly significant. They talked for 2 hours about things that were not the negotiation, about Earth, about history. Reyes was an easy talker. She had the particular quality of someone who was genuinely interested in the conversation they were in, who listened when the other person spoke without visibly waiting for their turn. Lyrian found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected. Then she asked the question she had been building toward for 3 weeks. "Can I ask you something personal?" Reyes said, "Sure." "When you came into that first session," Lyrian said carefully, "you were late. You had your coffee. You made a joke immediately. You were very relaxed in your presentation. I was terrified," Reyes said. Lyrian went still. Reyes looked at her with an expression that was curious and a little amused. "Is that surprising? Your behavior did not reflect it." "Well, no," Reyes said. I mean, I had a job to do. She picked up her coffee. Being terrified doesn't change the job. Lyrian sat with that for a moment. In most species I work with, she said, fear is a signal to retreat, to protect, to reduce exposure to the threat. Reyes thought about this in a genuine way, not the performed thoughtfulness of someone waiting to respond, but the actual processing pause of someone turning an idea over. Then she said, that makes sense for most things. But I don't know. I think we mostly learned that the things we were afraid of were going to happen whether we retreated or not, so you might as well face them. She said it simply, the way you said something that seemed obvious to you. Lyrian went back to her quarters and did not sleep. She wrote the report over 4 days. It went through 11 drafts. This was unusual. She generally wrote reports in 2 drafts, sometimes 1. She kept finding that the language she reached for was not accurate enough, not precise enough, kept softening or overstating what she was actually observing. The truth of it kept slipping sideways when she tried to contain it in professional language. She settled, finally, on the section that felt most important, the section about what she had actually found, underneath the behavior patterns and the battle recordings, and the threat index numbers. She wrote, the humans do not lack fear. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. Every human I have observed over this period is producing fear responses that are biologically measurable and genuine. The fear is real. What is absent is not the fear, but the fear's authority. In every other species I have worked with in 31 years, fear is an instruction the body gives that the mind obeys. In humans, it appears to be information the body provides that the mind then chooses what to do with. I do not yet fully understand the evolutionary history that produced this. I suspect it has something to do with the fact that for most of human history, the threats they faced were going to kill them whether they ran or not. A species that ran from predators survived slightly longer than one that stood and fought, but both died. What survived was the one that learned to be afraid and act anyway. To take the fear signal and make a decision with it, rather than simply obey it. She paused at this section for a long time. Then she added, the practical implication of this is significant. The threat index measures capability and observed aggression. It does not have a category for will, for what a species will accept as a loss before it stops. I have been trying to find the threshold, the point at which the fear becomes loud enough that the human response changes, that they retreat, that they recalculate. In 3 weeks of direct observation, I have not found it. I do not know if it exists. I think this is what the Kreth encountered, not a species that defeated them, a species that had not included defeat as an option and so simply kept going until the math changed. She wrote the final recommendation quickly, because she knew what it was. She had known it since the 2nd week. I recommend full diplomatic engagement. The humans are not a threat in the way the index defines threats. They are not expansionist. They are not predatory toward other species. They show consistent evidence of cooperation, of sacrifice for collective benefit, of a genuine desire to engage with the broader galactic community. But I also recommend that the Conclave understand clearly what it is engaging with. This is not a species we will be able to manage through standard diplomatic pressure. You cannot use the fear of consequences to move them, because consequences do not land on them the way they land on everyone else. What moves them, and I observed this consistently, is the presence of something worth protecting. Point them at something worth protecting and they become. There is no index number for what they become. She submitted the report. She sat in her quarters on Earth, looking out the window at the city. It was evening. The lights were coming on across the skyline, building by building, and it was raining lightly, and somewhere below she could hear the sound of the city going about its business. Traffic, voices, the distant rhythm of a place that had been afraid and busy and alive for a very long time. The Conclave raised the threat index to 9.1 the day after her report landed. She learned about it through a message from a colleague. She read the number. She thought about Elena Reyes with her coffee and her 12 minutes late arrival, and her perfectly calm voice saying being terrified doesn't change the job, and she thought that 9.1 was probably correct, and also probably missed the point entirely. She sent Reyes a message. It was outside protocol. She did it anyway. It said, I believe the formal sessions have been productive. On a personal note, thank you for the coffee. Reyes responded in 4 minutes. Anytime. Fair warning. I'm going to keep pushing on the border zone issue next session. Just want you to be prepared. Lyrian read that message twice and then, for the first time in 3 weeks, she laughed. She sat there in the quiet of her quarters with the rain outside and the city lights on and the laughter fading, and she thought, there it is. That is the thing no one has put in a report yet. That is the thing under all the data and the battle recordings and the index numbers. They were going to keep pushing on the border zone issue. Whatever happened, however it went, they were going to keep pushing. And they were going to bring coffee. Nobody went near the Void Beast. This was not a policy. It was not a law. It was not something written in any official conclave document, because you do not write down things that are simply understood. You do not write down, do not put your hand in fire. You do not write down, do not breathe underwater. Some things the universe communicates without needing a document, and the Void Beasts of Sector 9 were one of those things. They were not, in the conventional sense, aggressive. They did not hunt. They did not expand. They drifted. That was the word every researcher who had ever observed them from maximum safe distance used, because it was the only word that fit. They drifted through deep space in their slow, enormous clusters, moving at speeds that no warship would have found threatening, following paths that no one had ever successfully predicted. They did not have apparent goals. They did not have apparent territory. They simply existed, in the way that a storm exists, without malice and without mercy, as a feature of the universe that everything else had to navigate around. The thing they did, the pulse, was not a weapon. Every xenobiologist who had studied them agreed on this. It was, most likely, a form of communication, or navigation, or something that had no equivalent in any language the conclave had ever developed, because it came from a category of life so different from everything else that the comparison points simply didn't exist. Whatever it was, it broadcast on a frequency that hit the nervous systems of every known species the same way. It found the part of the brain that handled threat assessment, the ancient deep part that had been in every living thing since before anything had a name, and it turned that part up to its absolute maximum and held it there. The result was total. Not fear the way you felt before a difficult conversation, not fear the way you felt standing at a great height. The pulse produced the specific, unambiguous, full-body certainty that you were about to die, that death was immediate and enormous, and there was nothing in the universe that could prevent it. It lasted as long as you were within range. It stopped the moment you left. It left no permanent damage. It left no permanent damage because no species had ever stayed within range long enough to accrue any. The closest documented approach to an active Void Beast cluster had been made by a conclave research vessel 40 years prior. A volunteer crew, heavily medicated with every biological dampener available, with orders to get within 100,000 kilometers of the cluster edge and hold for 60 seconds. 60 seconds of data collection. That was all. The crew had trained for 8 months. They made it to 140,000 kilometers. At that distance, through the shielding, through the medication, through the training, through the professional discipline of a crew that had spent 8 months preparing for exactly this, the pulse hit them. 3 crew members lost consciousness. 2 more experienced what the medical report called acute derealization events. The remaining crew, still functional, made the unanimous decision to abort. They had been within detectable range for 11 seconds. The report from that mission was the most cited document in Void Beast research literature. Its conclusion, reached after extensive analysis and peer review, was 4 words: maintain maximum safe distance. That was the state of galactic knowledge on the Void Beasts when a cluster of them drifted, with the total indifference of something that had never needed to care about anything, into the Kepler-7 system, where 40 million humans lived on 3 planets. Senior Coordinator Veth of the Conclave's Emergency Response Division received the alert at what the humans in the affected system were currently calling 3 in the morning, which was the part of their rotation cycle when most of them were asleep, which meant that approximately 40 million people were unconscious and unaware that the most biologically terrifying thing in the known universe had just entered their star system and was drifting, with complete indifference, in the general direction of their homes. Veth looked at the sensor readings for a long time. Then he looked at the transit capacity of every vessel within range of the Kepler-7 system. Then he looked at the estimated time before the Void Beast cluster reached the inner planets. Then he looked at the number 40 million, and the transit capacity number, and the time estimate, and he did the math, and he sat very still for a moment, and then he called an emergency session of the response division. The session lasted 4 hours. The math did not change during those 4 hours. It stayed the same, clear and brutal. There was not enough transit capacity within range to evacuate 40 million people before the cluster arrived. The ships that could reach Kepler-7 in time could move, at maximum load, approximately 6 million people, which meant that 34 million people, doing absolutely nothing wrong, living their ordinary lives on their 3 planets, were going to be within range of the Void Beast pulse when it arrived, and there was nothing the Conclave could do about it. They began drafting the evacuation protocol for the 6 million. They began drafting the memorial resolution for the 34. Veth sent the alert to the Human Colonial Administration on Kepler-7 at the 4-hour mark, because it was their people, and they deserved to know, and also because there was a faint, professional part of him that was still going through the correct motions, even though the math had already finished the story. The Human Colonial Administration responded in 40 minutes. Their response was 1 page. It acknowledged the alert. It confirmed they had reviewed the sensor readings. It said they were activating their emergency protocols. It said they appreciated the Conclave's assistance with evacuation capacity and would coordinate on logistics. It also said, in the 3rd paragraph, that they were dispatching research vessels to the cluster. Veth read that paragraph 3 times. He sent a response. He said, carefully, that he wanted to confirm the translation was accurate. Research vessels, to the cluster. The Human Administration confirmed the translation was accurate. 3 ships, small crew on each, volunteers. They were moving out within the hour. Veth looked at this information, and then looked at his colleagues around the session table, and the colleagues looked back at him, and nobody said anything for a moment, because there was, genuinely, nothing to say. They had just finished the math on 40 million people, and the math was terrible, and here was the Human Administration, in the middle of that math, sending 3 ships toward the Void Beasts to look at them. Someone at the table said, very quietly, "Why?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. They watched on the long-range sensors. The 3 human ships moved out from Kepler-7's 2nd planet at a speed that suggested urgency without suggesting panic. They were small, research class, not military, not shielded for combat. They had the look of vessels built for curiosity rather than conflict, fitted with sensor arrays and collection equipment, and the kind of external mounting points that said someone had modified them in a hurry for a specific purpose. They moved directly toward the cluster. The Conclave monitoring station tracked them in real time. Veth watched the distance numbers count down. 1 million kilometers, 800,000, 600,000. The cluster's outer edge began to be visible on the enhanced imaging, vast, slow shapes moving in their incomprehensible drift patterns, dark against the deeper dark, enormous in a way that sensors conveyed technically, but that the eye could not properly process. The pulse range began at approximately 300,000 kilometers from the cluster edge. The human ships crossed that threshold. The monitoring station had biosign readers on the human vessels, standard equipment, installed during the diplomatic period when all parties had agreed to a mutual observation framework. The readers were not detailed, but they gave broad physiological data, heart rates, neural activity patterns, the rough shape of what was happening inside the ships. When the ships crossed the pulse threshold, every reading spiked. Every reading on every ship jumped the same way. Fast, high, the unmistakable signature of acute biological stress. The same signature the Conclave research vessel had shown 40 years ago, through all its shielding and medication, at 140,000 kilometers. The humans were getting it full force, at 300,000 kilometers, in ships with no specialized shielding, no biological dampeners, nothing between them and the pulse except the standard hull of a research vessel. The ships kept moving. Veth watched the distance counter. 250,000 kilometers. 200,000. The biosins stayed spiked, high, sustained, not dropping. The kind of reading that in a Conclave crew would have had the medical override kicking in by now, would have had the auto-retreat system activating, because those numbers indicated a crew that was at the absolute limit of what a nervous system could sustain and remain functional. 150,000 kilometers. The ships slowed, not stopped, slowed, and held a loose formation, and the sensor arrays began transmitting. Veth could see the data streams on the monitoring readouts, pouring back toward Kepler-7, enormous amounts of data, the ships recording everything they could from 150,000 kilometers from the edge of an active Void Beast cluster, while their crew's nervous systems were doing whatever was being done to them by the pulse. Someone in the monitoring station said softly, "They're taking readings." "Yes," Veth said. "While the pulse is active." "Yes." A pause. "How?" Veth did not have an answer. He kept watching. The 3 ships held position for 11 days. 11 days. The Conclave monitoring team ran shifts. They could not stop watching. Every shift handover involved the new team looking at the bioscene readings. Still spiked, still sustained. 11 days of continuous elevated biological stress. And then looking at the data streams. Still flowing, still enormous. The human ships recording without pause. And then looking at each other with the expression of beings who were watching something that didn't have a category. On the third day, the cluster shifted. A drift change, slow but clear, bringing the outer edge 2,000 kilometers closer to the human ships. The biosins spiked harder. The ships adjusted their position, moving slightly, recalibrating their formation. They stayed. On the seventh day, one of the ships sent a tight beam transmission back to Kepler-7 that was not data. It was a crew communication, personal, which the monitoring station did not intercept because it was not their business. But the transmission happened, which meant someone on one of those ships, 11 days into sitting inside a void beast pulse, had sent a message home. Veth thought about that for a long time during his shift. What you would say, what you would find to say, 11 days in, with that thing pressing on your nervous system every second. Whether you would say anything about what was happening to you, or whether you would talk about something else entirely, about the ordinary things, the things back home, the small details of a life you were doing this to protect. He suspected the latter, and he didn't know why he was so sure about that, but he was. On the 9th day, the analysts on Kepler-7 began broadcasting preliminary findings on an open frequency. Not classified, open, available to anyone with a receiver. Veth's team pulled the transmission and the xenobiologists on duty went through it. And then they went through it again. And then one of them came to Veth's station with an expression he had never seen on a xenobiologist's face before, which was an expression that looked a lot like being handed something you had been looking for your entire career and not being sure you were allowed to have it. They found a frequency, the xenobiologist said. Explain, Veth said. The void beasts, the pulse they emit. It's not uniform. It's a carrier frequency, with variations layered on top. The research team has isolated one of the variation frequencies and they've run the preliminary analysis and they think that specific frequency is aversive to the beasts. Something in their sensory biology that makes that particular frequency uncomfortable. Veth looked at him. Like a deterrent, the xenobiologist said. If you broadcast it at sufficient amplitude, the theory is, and this is preliminary, this is 11 days of data, they're very clear about that. The theory is, the beasts would move away from it. Move away, Veth said. Yes, without weapons. Without weapons. Because they find the sound unpleasant. Essentially, yes. Veth sat with that for a moment. In 11 days, he said. They figured that out in 11 days. They had 11 days of data, and apparently very motivated analysts. Veth thought about 40 million people on 3 planets. About 6 million evacuation slots. About the memorial resolution sitting in his outbox, unfinished, which he had not been able to bring himself to complete. How confident are they? He said. The xenobiologist said, confident enough that they're trying it. On the 11th day, the 3 research ships, after 11 days inside the pulse at 150,000 kilometers from the cluster edge, deployed a network of relay buoys in a perimeter formation around the cluster. The buoys were broadcasting on the aversive frequency at the amplitude the analysts had calculated. The cluster moved. Not fast, not dramatically. The void beasts did not flee. They drifted, the way they always drifted. But the drift had a new direction, and that direction was away from the buoy perimeter, and away from Kepler-7, and the movement was slow and enormous, and completely, utterly real. The monitoring station was very quiet. The 3 human ships turned back toward Kepler-7. The bioscene readings, as they crossed back out of pulse range, dropped. The spike came down. The sustained stress signal eased, and what replaced it was just the ordinary biological noise of tired people on a long flight home. Veth looked at the sensor readings for a long time. Then he looked at the memorial resolution in his outbox and deleted it. He sat in the quiet of the monitoring station with the readings showing 3 ships heading home and a void beast cluster drifting in a new direction away from 40 million people, and he thought about the question someone had asked at the beginning, the one that had gone unanswered. Why? He thought he understood it now, not fully, not in a way he could put cleanly into a report, but the shape of it. They had gone out there because the math said 34 million people were going to be within range of that pulse, and there was nothing to be done about it, and some group of humans had looked at that math and decided that the math was a starting point, not an answer. That the math was what you had before you went and looked at the thing directly, before you sat inside the thing that was supposed to be unsurvivable, and took 11 days of readings and found something in the data that the math hadn't included, because nobody had ever been close enough to look for it. The pulse had been hitting them the entire time. They had been afraid the entire time. 11 days of sustained biological terror, every nervous system in those ships screaming the same word over and over. They had taken notes.
The conclave convened the Threat Index Committee one more time.
They sat around the table with the Kepler-7 data, and the 11 days of biosyn readings and the research findings, and the sensor recordings of the cluster drifting away from the buoy network, and they had the same conversation they had been having since the first scout report came back from Earth, with a 2.1 on it. What number do you give them? The committee chair, a senior Velhari official named Orath who had been on the committee for 20 years, and had the patient demeanor of someone who had seen a lot but was open to seeing more, looked at the data for a long time. Then he said, "The index goes to 10. Someone said, "We've never recorded a 10. "No," Orath said, "we haven't. A 10 is theoretical. A 10 means we have no framework for the threat level." "Yes," Orath said, "that is what a 10 means." A long silence. "Are they a threat?" someone asked. Orath thought about this carefully. He thought about Lyrian's report, the one about fear and its authority. He thought about the battle at Jupiter and the laugh in the damaged ship's audio log. He thought about 11 days inside a void beast pulse, taking notes. "They are not a threat to us," he said. "But 10 is not only a measure of threat. It is a measure of something we have no existing category for, no prior data, no framework, something the index was not built to describe." He looked at the committee. "We record the 10, he said, "and we retire the index, because the index was built on the assumption that what a species can do is the most important thing about it. And I think we have enough data now to know that for this species, what they will do, what they choose to do with the fear they feel, is something the index simply cannot hold." He closed the file. The index was retired. In its place, the committee's official record noted only this: species designation, human, classification, uncontained. Refer all threat assessment queries to the diplomatic division. Note, they will want to help. 5 years after first contact, the conclave had a new problem. It was not the problem they had expected. In the early days, after the scout report, after the Kreth incident, after Lyrian's report, and the void beast data, and the retired index, the quiet assumption running through every briefing room and every diplomatic channel was that the humans were going to be difficult. Aggressive, maybe. Territorial, certainly. Every species that scored high on capability assessments eventually pushed outward. It was the pattern. You got strong enough, and you started wanting more space, more resources, more buffer between you and the things that could hurt you. The humans did not push outward. They pushed inward, into the conclave itself, into every committee, every working group, every diplomatic channel that would have them. They sent representatives to the border zone negotiations. They volunteered personnel for the deep space survey teams. They asked, politely, persistently, in the particular human way that managed to be both completely non-threatening and completely immovable, to be included in the conclave's crisis response framework. They wanted to help. This was the problem. Not because help was unwelcome. The conclave ran on cooperation, 47 species contributing to a collective framework that kept known space functional and mostly peaceful. Help was the point. Help was what the whole structure was built on. The problem was that the human's definition of help and the conclave's definition of help were not the same definition. The conclave's definition of help was, contribute what you can, within safe parameters, in situations where the risk is manageable. The human's definition of help was, go toward the thing that needs helping, regardless of what the thing is. These were not compatible frameworks. It had started small. A human volunteer on a deep space survey team had, without authorization, rerouted the survey vessel to investigate an anomalous signal that the mission parameters had flagged as outside safe operational range. The anomaly turned out to be a derelict Dravith vessel from a century-old conflict, with recoverable data that advanced the conclave's understanding of the Dravith communication system by an estimated 20 years. The human volunteer had been gently reprimanded for the unauthorized detour. She had said, simply, that the signal was there, and they were close, and it seemed like a waste not to look. The reprimand had not produced any visible change in behavior. Then there was the matter of the Sector 4 mining dispute. which had been running for 11 years and had produced 17 failed mediations and a low-grade conflict that was killing people slowly, the way unresolved disputes did. The conclave had the dispute on its active file. They were working on it. These things took time. The human diplomatic team that had been attached to the conclave's observer program had, in their 4th month of operation, submitted an unsolicited analysis of the Sector 4 dispute. It was 40 pages long. It was extremely well researched. It proposed a resource-sharing framework that no previous mediation team had tried because it required both parties to accept a short-term loss in exchange for long-term stability, which was the kind of proposal that sounded good in theory and historically failed in practice because no species liked accepting a short-term loss. The human team had also, apparently, spent 3 weeks having informal conversations with both parties' junior diplomatic staff, building the kind of ground-level relationships that formal mediation didn't reach. They had found, in those conversations, that both parties had internal factions that wanted resolution and were being drowned out by the louder factions that wanted to win. They had built a communication channel between those quiet factions. The framework was accepted 8 months later. 11 years, 17 mediations. 8 months once the humans started pushing on it. The Conclave's mediation division had feelings about this that were complicated enough that they did not put them in any official document. And then there was the patrol request. The humans wanted to help patrol the outer sectors. The outer sectors were where the difficult things lived, the unstable systems, the uncontacted species that were not yet ready for contact, the edges of territory where the Kreth occasionally tested the Conclave's boundaries and had to be reminded of the agreements they had signed. Patrol duty in the outer sectors was rotated among Conclave member species. It was dangerous work. Crew losses happened. The species that drew patrol rotations did it because they had agreed to do it, not because anyone enjoyed it. The humans had heard about the patrol rotation and asked to be included. This request went to the Conclave's Integration Committee, which had been formed specifically to manage human membership and which had been, in the 8 months of its operation, the most consistently exhausted committee in Conclave history. Committee Chair Drevith, a Kreth official who had been chosen for the role specifically because his species' history with the humans meant he was unlikely to be naive about them, read the patrol request and set it face down on his desk and left it there for 2 days. Then he called an emergency session. The session lasted 6 hours. The central question was not whether the humans could handle patrol duty, the data was unambiguous on that, but whether the Conclave was prepared for what happened when the humans encountered something on patrol that required a response the patrol protocols didn't cover, because the patrol protocols were built for species that, when they encountered something outside the protocols, would stop, assess, and request guidance. The humans would stop, assess, and then do something. Not recklessly. That was the thing that was hardest to explain to committee members who hadn't read all the data. It wasn't that the humans were reckless. They planned carefully. They gathered information. They thought about what they were doing. And then they did it. Even when the protocols said to wait. Even when guidance hadn't been received. Even when the correct procedure was to hold position and maintain communication, and let the appropriate bodies make the appropriate decisions through the appropriate channels. The humans found the appropriate channels very slow. Drevith sat in the session and listened to his colleagues go back and forth and felt, as he often did in integration committee sessions, the particular exhaustion of a being who understood both sides of a problem and could see that they were not going to be resolved by talking. He had read Lyrian's report 4 times. He had read the Kepler-7 data. He had read the battle recordings from the Kreth incident so many times he could recall specific timestamps from memory, which was not something he was proud of, but which had happened anyway. He had a speech he wanted to give. He gave it on the 3rd hour of the session, when the committee had talked itself into a circle for the 2nd time, and the energy in the room had the particular flat quality of a group that had run out of new things to say. He said, "I want to tell you what I think we are actually discussing." The room went quiet. "We are not discussing whether the humans are safe," he said. "We are not discussing whether they are capable. We are not discussing whether they will follow the protocols, because we already know the answer is mostly yes, and when no, they will have a reason, and the reason will be correct more often than we are comfortable admitting." He paused. "What we are discussing," he said, "is that we are afraid of them." Nobody denied it. "Not because they threaten us," Drevith said. "They have been here for 5 years and they have not threatened us once. Not because they are aggressive toward us. They have been nothing but willing. more willing than we have any framework to absorb. He looked around the table. We are afraid of them because they are the first species we have ever encountered that we cannot predict, cannot read, cannot move with the standard tools. We cannot frighten them into cooperation. We cannot tire them out with process. We cannot make the cost high enough that they recalculate. He let that sit for a moment. I was on the Kreth side of the Jupiter incident, he said. I was not in the fleet, but I served under Commander Dreth, and I read his report the day he filed it, and I want to tell you what I have never said in any official capacity. He looked at his hands on the table. When I read that report, the RAM, the crew that planned to survive it, the communication logs, I was afraid. I will admit that now. I was afraid of them, and I spent a long time afterward trying to understand why. Because they had not attacked us. They had defended their own people. That was all. He looked up. I finally understood it, he said. I was afraid because for the first time in my career I was looking at a species, and I could not find the limit. Every species has a limit, the point where the cost becomes too high, and they stop. Not because they are weak, because they are rational. Because survival is the base instruction every living thing runs on, and at some point survival says, stop, this is too much. He was quiet for a moment. I cannot find that point in them, he said. I have looked for 5 years, I cannot find it. And that is what frightens us. Not what they have done, what they might do, if something that mattered enough to them was threatened. How far they would go, whether there is a far enough. He picked up the patrol request from the center of the table. But I want to ask us something, he said. We evolved fear so that we would not walk into fire. Every species in this room evolved the same way. Fear is the instruction that kept us alive long enough to build all of this. He gestured broadly. At the room, at the conclave, at everything. Humanity evolved the same fear, same biology, same basic instruction. And somewhere in their history they looked at the fire, and they decided to walk into it anyway. Not because they didn't feel it, because something on the other side of the fire was worth more than the fear. He put the patrol request down. We have spent 5 years being afraid of that, he said. I would like to suggest that we have been afraid of the wrong thing. We should not be afraid of a species that walks into fire. We should be grateful that they exist, because there are things in this universe, things on this committee's active file right now, that require someone to walk into fire, and we have spent 6,000 years building a civilization specifically designed to avoid that. I am recommending we approve the patrol request, he said, and I am recommending that we stop trying to find a framework that contains them, and start building a framework that works with them. Because they are not going to become a species that waits for guidance. They are not going to become a species that holds position. They are going to keep going toward the things that need going toward, with or without our approval, and the only question is whether we are beside them when they do it. The vote was close. It passed. The first human conclave representative arrived for the formal membership ceremony on a Friday, which was a human measurement of time that meant nothing to anyone else present, but which she had mentioned in 3 separate pre-ceremony communications, with an emphasis suggesting it mattered. Her name was Dr. Amara Osei. She was a xenobiologist by training and a diplomat by necessity, which she had described in her biographical submission as, "Not my first choice, but here we are." She was calm in the specific way that Lyrian, watching from the observer gallery, recognized immediately the biological markers of a nervous system running high, and the behavior of someone who had made a decision about what they were going to do with that information. She was also carrying a bag. This was noted by the ceremony coordinator with some alarm because no one had briefed the human delegation that the formal membership ceremony did not involve bags. The coordinator sent a quick message to Dreveth. Dreveth sent back a message that said, "Let it go." Osei stood before the conclave's full assembly, 47 species, hundreds of representatives, the accumulated diplomatic weight of 6,000 years of galactic civilization, and she gave the formal acceptance address, which she had been provided in advance, which she delivered clearly and professionally. And then she reached into the bag. She produced a series of small packages, wrapped in paper, and set them on the table in front of her, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about this and decided to do it anyway. She said, "My grandmother always said you bring something when you come to someone's house for the first time. We've brought snacks. They're from Earth. If any of you have dietary restrictions I wasn't briefed on, I apologize. And also, you should have told me earlier." The assembly was very quiet. Then, from somewhere in the Kreth delegation, 3 rows back, from a young diplomat who had grown up reading the Jupiter incident files the way some beings grew up reading mythology, There was a sound. A laugh. Short, quickly suppressed, but real. And then, because laughter in a room has a way of finding the cracks in things, it spread, quietly, not uproarious, just the particular sound of several hundred beings releasing something they had been holding for a while without quite knowing they were holding it. Lyrian sat in the observer gallery and watched Osei at the table, opening her packages with the easy confidence of someone who was exactly as terrified as her biology said she was, and had made her peace with that, and she thought about the report she had written 3 years ago, about fear and its authority, about the threshold she had never been able to find. She thought about Dreveth's speech, which he had shared with her privately before the session, about walking into fire, about 6,000 years of a civilization built specifically to stay away from things that burned. She thought about 40 million people on 3 planets, and 11 days of biosign readings that never dropped, and notes taken inside a pulse that the entire rest of the galaxy ran from. She thought about 7 ships following 12 into close range because someone had done the math on 17 minutes and decided the cost was worth it. She thought about Elena Reyes, 12 minutes late, coffee in hand, perfectly calm in all the ways that mattered, and afraid in all the ways that didn't slow her down even slightly. She thought about all of it, and about the small wrapped packages on the table, and about the laugh that had moved through the assembly like something long overdue, and she understood something she had been approaching for 3 years without quite arriving at it. The galaxy had been afraid of humanity for 5 years. It had been afraid of the wrong thing. What humanity was, at the bottom of all the data and the battle recordings, and the index numbers, and the retired categories, was not a threat. It was not a weapon. It was not a force to be managed or contained or carefully directed. It was a reminder that the universe was full of fire, and that fire could be studied and measured and sometimes even redirected if you were willing to sit inside it long enough to take notes. A reminder that fear was information, not instruction. That the gap between feeling something and being controlled by it was the gap where everything interesting happened. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room was not the thing that didn't feel anything. It was the thing that felt everything, and went anyway. Osei stayed late after the ceremony. Most of the assembly had moved to the formal reception. Osei had spent an hour at the reception, which she had been good at: easy conversation, genuine interest, the particular quality of someone who was actually listening, and then she had drifted back to the main chamber, which was empty now, and she was standing in the center of it looking up at the ceiling, which was very high, and had been designed by a species whose aesthetic sense ran toward the vertical. Dreveth found her there. He was not sure why he had come back. He had told his aide he forgot something. He had not forgotten anything. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the human representative standing in the empty chamber, looking up. He said, "What are you thinking about?" She looked over at him. She did not seem surprised to see him. "The ceiling," she said. "Who designed this room?" "The Velhari," he said, 2,000 years ago. "It's beautiful," she said. He looked up at it. He had been in this room hundreds of times. He had never thought about the ceiling. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "Are you afraid?" he said, "right now, being here." She considered it, the honest pause of someone actually checking. "Yes," she said. "Of what?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Of getting it wrong. Of representing 8 billion people and making the wrong call somewhere and not knowing it until it's too late to fix." She looked at him. "That's mostly what I'm afraid of. Not the room, not the other species, not any of the things I think you might mean." He thought about that. "That does not seem like an unreasonable fear," he said. "No," she said. "It seems like the right thing to be afraid of, so I try to pay attention." She looked back up at the ceiling. "And I brought snacks." He stood there in the empty chamber for a moment. The ceremony was over. The galaxy had changed. 47 species were now 48, and the 48th had walked in 12 minutes late with a bag, and a reasonable fear, and the complete, quiet certainty that being afraid of the right things was not the same as being stopped by them. He said, "Welcome to the conclave, Dr. Osei." She smiled. "The real kind." "Thanks," she said. "We'll try not to break anything." He walked back toward the reception, and he did not say the thing he was thinking, because some things you kept to yourself. But he thought it clearly, in the quiet of the corridor, with the sounds of 48 species behind him, doing the work of building something together. He thought, "You will break everything, and then you will fix it, and we are going to be all right."